The house stood alone, where the forest began, its weathered boards and sagging roof bearing the marks of time. It wasn't a grand house, but it had endured, through storms, rain, and neglect. The peeling paint and cracked windows told a story of resilience, much like its sole resident, James Hunter. For James, this modest structure was more than a house. It was a fortress, a barrier between himself and the chaos of the world. Here, at the edge of the woods, he lived in a quiet solitude that matched the rhythm of his heart. James's life was simple and steady, designed to keep him at peace. Each morning, like clockwork, he rose with the sun. His coffee pot, an ancient percolator that hissed and sputtered like an old friend, brewed his first cup of the day. He'd sit on the sagging porch, the wood creaking beneath his chair, staring out at the endless expanse of trees. The forest was alive with soft rustles and the occasional bird call, a world apart from the one James had left behind. His appearance reflected years of discipline. James's graying hair was always neatly combed, and his face clean-shaven, a relic of his military days. Decades in the service had etched discipline into his very being, even though those days were long past. But no amount of routine could wash away the memories. The battles, the acrid scent of gunpowder, and the faces of comrades lost. These stayed with him, lurking in the quiet corners of his mind. Yet, he never spoke of them, not out of shame, but because there was no one left to hear. Today began like any other. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting golden patches on the patchy grass. James took his time with his coffee, savoring the quiet. But beneath the tranquility, the weight of his past pressed against him like an old wound that refused to heal. The solitude he cherished was also a double-edged sword, amplifying the ghosts that haunted him. After finishing his coffee, James stood and stretched, his joints groaning in protest. His body, like his house, bore the wear and tear of a life well lived. His day would follow its usual course, tending to his vegetable garden, repairing the house's sagging porch, and tinkering in his shed. The shed was his sanctuary, filled with tools and unfinished projects that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far. But even the most self-sufficient man must occasionally venture into town. Supplies were running low, and James reluctantly prepared for the trip. Leaving his haven always unsettled him, but necessity demanded it. He climbed into his battered old pickup truck, its faded paint and creaking engine as familiar as an old friend. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up a thin cloud of dust as it headed toward the small town. The town was as unremarkable as James himself. A single main street lined with aging storefronts and a quietness that mirrored the woods he came from. James parked in front of the general store, nodding briefly to the shopkeeper as he stepped inside. He moved through the aisles with purpose, gathering canned goods, coffee, and other essentials. Conversation was minimal, just the way James preferred it. On his way back home, something unusual caught his eye. A dark shape lay crumpled at the side of the road. Slowing the truck, James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. It was a dog, a large, battered animal with fur matted by dirt and streaked with blood. James pulled over and stepped out cautiously. The dog opened its eyes as he approached, its gaze dull but watchful. James crouched low, his voice soft. "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog growled weakly, more a warning than a threat. Its ribs jutted out, a stark sign of hunger and hardship. Something about the animal struck a chord deep within James, a shared understanding of suffering and survival. He hesitated. Taking the dog in would mean responsibility, something James had avoided for years. But leaving it here to die wasn't an option. With a resigned sigh, James fetched an old blanket from the truck. He approached slowly, wrapping the dog as gently as he could before lifting it into the passenger seat. The dog whimpered but didn't resist. "Guess you're coming with me," James muttered as he started the engine. The drive back was silent, the dog lying motionless except for the occasional pained whine. James glanced over, noticing the scars that covered its body. This wasn't just any stray. This dog had seen hardship, violence, and survival. In a strange way, it reminded James of himself. When they reached the house, James carried the dog inside and laid it on an old quilt in the corner of the living room. He brought water and some scraps of food, setting them within reach. The dog watched him with wary eyes but didn't eat. As the evening wore on, James found himself sitting on the floor beside the animal. For the first time in years, he spoke about things he hadn't even admitted to himself. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said, his voice low. "I know that look. I've seen it in the mirror." The dog didn't respond, of course, but its eyes softened, just a little. James leaned back against the wall, letting the silence stretch between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house didn't feel so empty. The morning sunlight streamed through the cracks in the old house, painting streaks of gold across the wooden floor. James woke slowly, his body stiff from sleeping on the floor beside his unexpected guest. His back ached, and his neck protested as he shifted, but he didn't complain. His gaze fell on the dog lying on the old quilt in the corner. It was still, save for the steady rise and fall of its chest, a small relief after the events of the previous day. James approached cautiously, crouching beside the dog. Its injuries were worse than he had initially thought. Deep cuts, a fractured leg, and scars that hinted at a life of violence and hardship. He ran his fingers over the dusty first aid kit he had pulled out the night before. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "All right, Rex," James muttered, testing the name out loud. "Let's see what we can do for you." The dog flinched slightly as James worked, splinting the leg with a broom handle and wrapping it tightly with bandages. Despite the obvious pain, Rex remained remarkably calm, his eyes watching James intently. There was something about those eyes, tired yet resilient, that stirred something deep within James. Over the next few days, Rex began to heal. Slowly but surely, the dog's strength returned. James found himself slipping into a new routine, one that revolved not just around his own survival but Rex's as well. Each morning, James would brew his coffee, step onto the porch, and watch as Rex limped around the yard, exploring his new surroundings. The dog was cautious but observant, watching James's every move as though trying to decipher him. At first, it was wary of James's touch, but as the days turned into weeks, trust began to build. Rex would sit by James's feet as he worked in the garden or tinkered in the shed, his presence quiet yet comforting. In the evenings, James spoke to Rex as if the dog were an old friend. He shared stories he had long buried, memories of his military days, the battles he had fought, and the comrades he had lost. Rex didn't respond, of course, but he listened in his own way, his ears twitching and his eyes never leaving James. It was the kind of companionship James hadn't realized he was missing. "You've seen things too," James murmured one night, his hand resting on Rex's scarred side. "You've been through hell, haven't you? Just like me." Rex's gaze softened, and for a moment, it felt as though the two of them truly understood each other. Both had lived through pain and hardship, and both had survived. Together, they found a quiet solace in each other's presence. But peace was a fragile thing. One afternoon, while James was in town picking up supplies, a shadow of trouble crossed his path. He was loading a bag of dog food into his truck when the roar of motorcycles shattered the quiet of the small town. He turned to see a group of 5 bikers pulling into the gas station parking lot. Their leather jackets bore patches that screamed danger, and their loud laughter carried a sharp edge. James kept his head down, focusing on his task. He had no interest in trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had an interest in him. "Hey, old man," one of the bikers called out. His voice was loud, mocking. James ignored him, closing the truck bed and preparing to leave. The biker wasn't having it. He sauntered over, a sneer plastered across his face. "What's the matter? Too good to say hello?" James glanced up, his expression calm but firm. "Just minding my business." The biker laughed, the sound grating. "Well, ain't that polite? But see, you're on our turf now, old man. And I don't think we like your face." James felt the tension rising, but he refused to engage. Years of discipline had taught him the value of restraint. "I'm just here for supplies," he said evenly, climbing into his truck. But as he started the engine, the biker stepped in front of the vehicle, blocking his path. The rest of the group joined in, their laughter filling the air. James's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. The leader of the group, a tall man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, leaned against the truck. A little respect, old-timer. Maybe a donation for using our town. James stared at him, unflinching. I don't want trouble. Too late, the leader sneered, slamming his fist against the hood of the truck. James clenched his jaw, his years of training kicking in. He assessed the situation quickly. He could fight back, but that would only escalate things. For now, retreat was the best option. I'll be going now, James said, his voice cold. The leader laughed, stepping aside just enough for James to drive off. But as he left, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That night, as he sat on the porch with Rex by his side, James's mind was restless. The biker's arrogance and aggression were a stark reminder of the world he had tried to leave behind. He glanced at Rex, who sat alert, his ears twitching at every sound. "We'll be ready," James said quietly, more to himself than to Rex. The dog's head turned, and for a moment, James thought he saw understanding in those scarred eyes. Together, man and dog prepared for what they both knew was coming. A storm on the horizon that would test their newfound bond. The days following James's encounter with the bikers were eerily quiet. Too quiet. The solitude he once cherished now felt heavy, weighed down by the sense of something looming just beyond the tree line. Even Rex seemed more alert, his ears constantly twitching and his gaze fixed on the horizon. It started small, signs that James wasn't as alone as he thought. Tire tracks appeared in the dirt outside his property, deep grooves that didn't match his old truck. Broken beer bottles littered the edge of his yard, shards glinting in the sunlight like a warning. At first, James brushed it off as nothing more than idle troublemakers. But as the days passed, the incidents grew bolder. One morning, James found his garden trampled, the wooden stakes pulled out and scattered. Another night, the distant hum of motorcycles echoed through the woods, the sound carrying a sinister promise. "They're testing us," James muttered to Rex as he fixed the damaged garden fence. Rex, standing beside him, let out a low growl, as if agreeing. James knew he couldn't afford to wait for the next move. His military instincts kicked in, sharpening his focus. He walked the perimeter of his property, studying every vulnerable spot. The sagging porch, the thin windows, the rickety shed. All weaknesses he would have to fortify. "I've spent my life defending others," James said to Rex one evening as he worked on reinforcing the front door with extra planks. "Now it's time to defend what's mine." Rex watched him silently, his steady presence a source of strength. The storm James had been anticipating came on a moonless night. He was sitting in his living room, a shotgun resting across his lap, when he heard the unmistakable hum of engines. The sound grew louder, closer, until it surrounded the house. Rex was on his feet instantly, his ears flattened and his teeth bared. James stood, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "They're here," he muttered. The bikers made no attempt to hide their presence. They circled the house, their laughter and shouts cutting through the stillness of the night. Headlights illuminated the yard, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. "Come on out, old man," one of them yelled. "Let's have a little fun." James didn't move. He'd spent the past few days preparing for this moment. The trip wires he'd set around the property were ready, and the tools in his shed had been repurposed into makeshift traps. The first trap triggered as one of the bikers tried to approach the shed. A loud crash echoed through the night as a pile of metal cans collapsed, startling the man and drawing curses from the group. James stepped onto the porch, his shotgun aimed skyward as he fired a warning shot. The blast silenced the bikers for a moment, their laughter replaced by an uneasy murmur. "Get off my property," James said, his voice calm but firm. The leader, Snake, the man with the tattoo curling around his neck, stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "You think you can scare us, old man?" he taunted, pulling a pistol from his belt. James didn't flinch. "This is your last warning." Snake laughed, gesturing to his crew. "Let's show him what happens when you mess with us." The bikers surged forward, but James was ready. The trip wires set off a chain reaction, sending planks, nails, and other improvised defenses crashing down. One of the men let out a yelp as he stumbled into a hidden pit James had dug near the porch. Rex joined the fray, his growl turning into a fierce bark as he lunged at one of the bikers who had ventured too close. The man tried to swat him away, but Rex was relentless, his teeth sinking into the intruder's arm. James took aim, firing at the ground near another biker's feet, forcing him to retreat. The sound of gunfire and Rex's growls created chaos, disorienting the group. Snake, however, was undeterred. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at James. But before he could fire, Rex broke away from his target, leaping at Snake with a ferocity that stunned everyone. The biker stumbled back, dropping his weapon as Rex pinned him to the ground. "Call them off," James ordered, his shotgun trained on Snake. The other bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. Snake, struggling under Rex's weight, finally relented. All right, fall back." One by one, the bikers retreated, their motorcycles roaring to life as they sped off into the night. Rex stepped back, his body tense as he watched them go. James lowered his shotgun, his heart pounding as the adrenaline began to fade. He looked down at Rex, whose fur was matted with dirt and blood, but whose eyes were as sharp and steady as ever. "You did good, boy," James said, kneeling to pat Rex's head. "You did real good." The next morning, James surveyed the damage. The yard was littered with debris, but the house had held strong. He spent the day cleaning up, repairing what he could, and making notes on how to strengthen his defenses further. Rex followed him closely, his limp more pronounced after the night's events, but his spirit unbroken. James made sure to treat the dog's wounds, grateful for the loyalty and bravery Rex had shown. As the sun set, James and Rex sat on the porch, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. The horizon glowed with the soft hues of twilight, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace. "They'll be back," he said quietly, his hand resting on Rex's head. "But so will we." Rex let out a soft huff, as if agreeing. Together, they looked out at the woods, the bond between them stronger than ever. In that moment, James realized that he wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was defending his family.